In my last video on the dwarf gourami, I showed you how they can use jets of water to hunt for insects perched on branches just above the waterline. This is known as ballistic predation, and it's the same hunting technique used by archer fish to knock insects into the water. My original idea was to film my dwarf gourami using ballistic predation to hunt for live prey above the surface of the water. So I went to my local pet store and asked for what are known as pinhead crickets, which are basically newborn crickets. I was told that they didn't have any pinhead crickets, but they would be happy to order some for me. So I thought, awesome, let's do it. I was then told that they could only order them in quantities of 1,000 crickets at a time, and that the cost would be around $40. So the cost of the crickets and the quantity that I needed to order quickly put an end to that idea. But I'm well liked at my local pet store, so they said they'd go through their cricket bins and pull out the smallest ones that they could find. I figured, all right, let's give it a try. I'll take a dozen of the smallest crickets that you have. So I returned home with some fairly small crickets and began to set my plan into motion. I put a cricket on a small branch just above the waterline and waited. Of course, the scared little cricket refused to move, so the gourami had no idea that it was there, and it was almost as if the cricket didn't want to be eaten by a fish. I added a second cricket to the branch, hoping that this one would be a bit more active. It did move around more than the first one, but he was missing one of his back legs, which made him a little clumsy. The dwarf gourami did see the second cricket when it fell in the water, so he came over to inspect it, but decided that it was too big to eat. And since the cricket with one back leg kept falling off of the branch, I had to keep taking it out of the water and putting it back on. Every time the little cricket moved, it attracted the attention of the gourami, but nothing went as planned. However, he did spit jets of water at the cricket, just as I expected he would. I even added a third cricket with both of its back legs, so this one was very active, but still nothing seemed to work. So after an hour or so of trying, I gave up and decided to try something else. I put some blackworms inside a glass jar to see if he would use his water-spitting skills to flush the worms out of the jar and into the open where he could reach them. I knew that it was very unlikely, but I figured it was worth a try. Unfortunately, the angle of the bottle made it far too easy for the worms to get out through the opening, so it wasn't much of a challenge for him to pull the worms out one by one as they attempted to escape. I've tried this with several different species over the years, and it's always interesting to see how they react. When I did this with tiger barbs, they went crazy trying to get at the worms inside the bottle. But this dwarf gourami has a very different personality than my tiger barbs, so he uses a much more careful and delicate approach. And if these blackworms knew what was waiting for them outside the bottle, they probably wouldn't be trying so hard to escape. And now I can't help but wonder what would happen if I put a ghost shrimp inside a glass bottle. Would the shrimp be able to sense the danger outside of the bottle and choose to stay inside where it was safe? It seems to me that the shrimp has a much more sophisticated set of senses that would tell it that there's a predator nearby, so it might choose to remain in the bottle and away from danger. And the more I think about it, the more I want to set up a little experiment to try and see if my assumptions about the shrimp are correct. So at some point in the near future, you can look forward to seeing a ghost shrimp inside a glass bottle while a hungry fish hovers nearby. Let me know what you think of this idea in the comment section below. I can only assume that a ghost shrimp is smarter than a blackworm, and my guess is that the shrimp won't leave the bottle while there's a fish waiting just outside. And now it's time for a short commercial break because these ads help me pay the rent. So please stick around because there's a lot more cool stuff to see. My dwarf gourami loves his live blackworms, so I always try to keep some on hand. I store them in the fridge right next to the human food because they prefer cool water and because my wife is incredibly tolerant of my obsession with fish. So she's perfectly fine with me keeping worms in the refrigerator, and I guess this sort of makes up for all of the useless stuff that she buys after watching TikTok videos. I mean, seriously, do we really need a portable electric blender or a rechargeable vegetable chopper? Wouldn't our money be better spent on live blackworms? I think so, and I'm sure that this dwarf gourami will agree. Just look at how excited he gets when he knows that I'm about to feed him some live blackworms, and I'm sure that not many people get this excited over a portable electric blender. And why do we even need a portable blender in the first place when all of our blending needs are taken care of at home? We really should be limiting our impulse buys to new fish that we see at the local shop, because fish are way better than anything you can find on Temu or TikTok. Okay, I got sidetracked a little there, so let's get back to the beautiful fish. Watch closely and you'll be able to see this gourami eat a blackworm, only to have the feisty little worm escape through the fish's gill cover. However, blackworms are completely aquatic, so any worms that happen to avoid being eaten right away will be able to burrow down into the substrate where they'll live until the gourami finds them. Another interesting fact about these worms is that if one of them is broken into two pieces, both halves of the worm will survive. And long after I'm done putting the black worms into his tank, the gourami will spend hours searching for any worms that he might have missed. This keeps him active and curious, which makes this aquarium more fun to watch as he hunts for food, just like he would in the wild. So it's a lot more enjoyable for both of us. Now, can you really say the same thing about a portable electric blender? I doubt it. As you watch this gourami eat these worms, notice how he uses suction to pull the worms into his mouth. And this feeding technique is not unique to the dwarf gourami. In fact, nearly all fish use suction to ingest their food. It's called inertial feeding, and it's the most effective way to feed in the water. And here's the reason why. If a fish races forward to capture its prey, the rapid movement of the fish displaces the water in front of it, which would then push the food away from the fish. So most fish avoid this problem by slowly approaching their prey so they don't rapidly displace the water in front of them. Then, when the fish is close enough to the target, it uses suction to pull the prey into its mouth. And this is the way a fish uses suction to feed on things like flake food, which would be very difficult to eat if the fish was just biting at the flakes. So they use the mouth like a vacuum cleaner to suck in the food rather than biting at it. Of course, this gourami eats other things besides live blackworms because it's important to provide your fish with a wide variety of foods. I prefer to use floating pellets rather than flakes because the flakes can be a bit messy and the really small pieces of flake food always end up at the bottom of the tank uneaten. Now if I had smaller fish such as neon tetras and Corydoras catfish in this tank, feeding flakes would be less problematic because they would clean up the tiny bits of flake food that the dwarf gourami would probably ignore. However, like most of my aquariums, this is a single species setup, so I can tailor everything to the needs of this one fish, and I don't have to worry about other species getting enough food. I also don't have to worry about aggression. But no matter what type of setup you have and what kind of food you decide to feed your fish, there will always be little bits of food that sink to the bottom and are left uneaten. And this is where snails can be quite useful because they're always more than willing to clean up any mess left behind by the fish. In fact, I have 22 aquariums and they all have snails in them except one, and that's my bluegill tank because my bluegills will eat any snail that they can find. I really wish that they wouldn't eat the snails though because they're messy fish and I'd love to have a little cleanup crew in the bluegill tank. And as far as this Neon Blue Dwarf Gourami goes, he's not picky about what he eats either, but thankfully he doesn't eat the snails. He does love his mosquito larvae though, and I have some great footage of him going crazy as he hunts them down, but that will have to wait for the next video. I also plan on getting some wingless fruit flies and putting them on a small branch above the water to see if he'll be able to spot them and then knock them down by spitting water at them. So I have lots of plans for this beautiful fish, and if you've never kept them before, you may want to give them a try. They're easy to feed and they're not the least bit shy, so they're always out and about where you can see them. However, some individuals can be slightly aggressive, so they don't always work well in a community tank. And what I recommend is to design the aquarium around the dwarf gourami rather than add it to an established community of other species. A single male dwarf gourami would be fine in a 10-gallon tank. They don't like a strong current, so keep that in mind, and providing them with lots of live plants would be a good idea as well. In the past, these fish have gotten a bad reputation due to the fact that they sometimes get a sickness called the dwarf gourami iridovirus, but not all of them end up getting the virus, so it's a bit of a gamble. However, as far as I know, if they do happen to have it, it's always fatal. So there's some risk involved, but I think that the risk is well worth it for such a beautiful fish. I've had this one for a little over 4 months now, and he's still going strong, so hopefully he's virus-free and he lives to a ripe old age. Well, that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching another one of my videos, and I really hope that you have a beautiful day.